Good morning, bonjour. Je m'appelle Monia Mazik et je suis la coordinatrice nationale de la coalition pour la surveillance. Je suis la coordinatrice nationale de la coalition pour la surveillance internationale des libertés civiles. I am the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. I have been involved with the case of Khaled Al Qazzaz since the fall 2013, few months after he was detained in Cairo. I was involved on two levels. Personal level, as Sarah Attia, the Canadian-born wife of Mr. Al Qazzaz, contacted me to ask for advice and help, and later with the ICLMG in my capacity as the national coordinator. Since the beginning, when Mr. Al Qazzaz was arrested, we called upon the Canadian government to exercise political pressure on the Egyptian government so Mr. Al Qazzaz is released and returned safely to his family. That eventually worked out, and Mr. Al Qazzaz has been released in December 2014. Unfortunately, Mr. Al Qazzaz was never allowed to go back to Canada. Even worse, his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children who joined him there were prevented from flying back to Canada. Last March 24th, ICLMG and 9 other human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association, the Rideau Institute, UNIFOR, and others sent an appeal to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in his capacity as Minister of Youth to do everything in his power to end the ordeal of this family and help them bring them home to Canada. So far, we didn't receive a reply. This is unacceptable. The fate of 4 Canadian children, as well as their mothers and dads, are in the hands today of the Canadian government, and the Canadian government is not responding so far. Today, this family faces a huge dilemma. They have to choose between bad and worse. They have to choose between staying in Egypt together or maybe coming to Canada and be separated. If Sarah and her kids come to Canada, leaving their husband and dad, Khaled Al Qazzaz, in Egypt, they will be traumatized, suffering, forever tormented by the guilt, with the likely possibility that they will never see their loved one again. If they stay together in Egypt, they will be in limbo. The kids would not receive Canadian education, they cannot see their friends, they cannot see their family, their teachers, and their fathers and mom will be at the mercy and the whim of the Egyptian authorities. This can stay forever. This can stay for years. Already it has been over a year that they were living in limbo. Fortunately, there is a third choice: Canada intervention. Canada using its new responsible conviction principle to show Canadian and the world that we act responsibly when tragedy like this one happens. We act responsibly, swiftly, and with strong conviction when human rights are abused, and to show that the human rights should be respected. We urge today the Canadian government to use this third choice and to do the right thing as soon as possible, before things get more dangerous and before things get worse. Waiting is not a choice. Action is the only alternative left to Khaled Al Qazzaz and his family. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Alex Neve, the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. Bonjour, je m'appelle Alex Neve, je suis Secrétaire Général d'Amnesty International Canada, branche anglophone. Khaled Al Qazzaz, Sarah Attia, and their 4 young children have been trapped in a frightening and confusing labyrinth of human rights violations, injustice, secrecy, and fear in Egypt for nearly 3 years now. Khaled Al Qazzaz, a permanent resident of Canada, has endured arbitrary arrest, illegal detention, over 500 days in solitary confinement, harsh prison conditions, health problems, cruel treatment, and utter disregard for important international human rights standards guaranteeing fair trials and due process. All of this at the hands of Egyptian authorities. Though out of prison now, his nightmare is not over. His release is conditional, and he is virtually being held a prisoner in Egypt, barred from leaving the country and returning home to Canada to resume family life, receive proper medical care, and rebuild his life. He needs to be sure the Canadian government is sparing no effort to resolve his case and bring him home. His wife, Sarah Attia, and their 4 young children, all Canadian citizens, are suffering alongside their husband and father. His fear is their fear. His suffering is their suffering. And now his inability to leave Egypt stands in the way of their return to Canada as well. The Canadian government must intervene actively on their behalf to insist that their rights are fully protected, including their freedom of movement and their right to family life. Egyptian authorities have had 33 months to bring forward evidence, to lay charges, and to initiate fair proceedings if there were any basis to allegations that Khaled Al Qazzaz was involved in anything criminal while serving in the government of Mohamed Morsi. They have never done so. Instead, they have resorted to cruel injustice and threats to keep this family trapped in a life of daily uncertainty and constant fear. The situation has been undeniably particularly agonizing for Khaled and Sarah's young children, who were deeply anguished during the 1.5 years that their father was imprisoned, and now live with continuous worry about his health and well-being, and fear that it will happen again, and that they may again be separated from their father. This has to end, and that requires strong action from the Canadian government at senior levels, including from Foreign Affairs Minister Stéphane Dion, insisting that this family be allowed to return home to Canada.
Bonjour, I am Tara Collins. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Ryerson University, and I have been working in the area of children's rights for the last 20 years. I'm here to lend my support to this family and urge the Government of Canada to act accordingly to bring this family home. While my colleagues have already explained the important elements of this case in general terms and in terms of the family, I want to focus specifically on the situation of the 4 children in question. They have human rights. Under international human rights law, the family itself is a long-standing group in society that requires protection and care by the state and by society, as the Universal Declaration on the Human Rights outlines. This has been subsequently affirmed in international law in various international instruments that Canada has signed and ratified. But it's also specifically the rights of the children in question. Abdelrahman, 10 years old, Amina, 7 years old, Fatima, 6 years old, and Tahir, 3 years old. All 4 of these children need to be remembered in this situation. They are living a life of instability and fear, not knowing what's going to happen to their father, with imminent risk of future harm, as well as the fact that their family could be torn apart again. And it is incredibly important that the Government of Canada respond appropriately to the provisions in international law, and specifically the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to think and act and respond to the children's best interests, that these interests should be taken into account. As the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has identified, that potential separation of children from their parents must be a major consideration and must be respected and responded to. And so I urge the Government of Canada to pay attention to the images of these 4 children and respond to them. They need their parents. They need the peace and security that Canada can offer. And so therefore, please respond to what they need and to their human rights. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ahmed Attia, the brother of Sarah Attia. I'm honored to stand here today with Alex, with Munya, with Tara, who have been championing our case that has remained unresolved for over 1,000 days. I stand before you today to speak on behalf of Khaled, who is not only my brother-in-law and not only a Canadian permanent resident, but he was my best friend at the University of Toronto when we studied together before he married my sister. Khaled has sacrificed so much for me and for so many Canadians, and which is why we all have not stopped fighting for his freedom. We are a family of 9 children, all born in Mississauga, Ontario. Sarah is 2 years older than me, and we have always been extremely close. My daughter, Liana, is the same age as their daughter, Tahrir, who are in daycare together, and since they left Canada, she has asked about Tahrir daily. But 1 year later, she asks less and less about her. Sarah, Khaled, and their 4 children have been subjected to grave human rights violations that have affected all of them physically and psychologically. Khaled was held incommunicado for 5.5 months, 1 year of arbitrary detainment and difficult solitary confinement that has caused permanent damage to his spine that requires medical intervention unavailable in Egypt. My nieces Amina, Fatima, and Tahrir, and my nephew Abdurrahman, all under the age of 10, have been psychologically traumatized by the 2-year experience. And for the last 2 years, thousands of Canadians spoke up. And with the help of the government, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, Khaled was finally released in January 2015 by the order of the Egyptian Prosecutor General. And when Sarah and the children traveled to Egypt shortly after to bring their father home, that 2-week trip became a 13-month ordeal. Instead of allowing the family to return to Canada, the Egyptian authorities have taken actions to restrict them. They have detained them at the Cairo airport twice without legal justification, and months later, a travel ban was issued against Khaled without cause. Sarah's savings were intended to cover her husband's medical coverage, but instead were confiscated by the government, and her bank accounts have been closed. Their family business has been confiscated without any legal basis. I could never imagine that one day our family, who has given so much to our country, would find ourselves in many ways abandoned by our government. While the Canadian ambassador to Egypt has worked relentlessly to resolve this, here in Ottawa, little has been done to escalate the matter. The Canadian government has asked us to bring Sarah and the children home, leaving Khaled behind. Yet I cannot comprehend the impact on the children when they are split from their father again, not knowing when and if Khaled will ever be able to join them. The Canadian government has a moral and legal obligation and responsibility to protect the rights of these 4 children and facilitate their return home with their father. I have been urging the Canadian government for months to intervene and end this ordeal, but to no avail. Today, I am holding the Canadian government responsible for their safety. The situation in Egypt, the political climate has become very difficult, and there is a serious risk to their safety. Khaled did not commit any crime. There are no legal barriers to his safe return to Canada, and he was never charged. At the end of the day, the resolution boils down to political will. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Janice Dixon with Politics. Moni, I've got a question for you. Possibly others could answer this as well. But you mentioned that one of the options is for Sarah and the children to separate from their father and come back to Canada. What's preventing them from doing that and then sort of dealing with their father and her husband's case separately?
Well, I think first of all, this is a theoretical alternative. I don't know if she will be let go, but even if she is as a Canadian with her 4 Canadian kids, I think morally this is not a choice because given that Khaled Al Qazzaz was arrested and put in prison without charges, without any conviction, without anything, the same thing can happen to him again. And I think we are very worried, and as well as Sarah, and that to see this action of her leaving her husband is maybe interpreted as the green light of to the Egyptian authority to put him back in prison. It's not, we don't want to give, and I totally understand her as a wife, as a mother, she cannot leave her husband alone, especially in those difficult circumstances in Egypt. So I think there are other possibilities that can be tried and that can be worked upon by the government here in Canada to help this family to come back all together instead of separating them and create, this sort of trauma in the kid's mind, in the wife's mind, and this impression of abandonment with Khaled's case in Egypt.
Do you know what their living conditions are like?
They currently live with his family. They do not leave their home unless required because of their safety. The children only recently have started to go back to school because there is no end in sight on this matter. And most recently, they are very scared. And to your first question, the eldest son here in Canada was receiving psychological assistance, from a physician to overcome the trauma that he went through, seeing his father detained and visiting him in prison. Today, one of the daughters wakes up nightly to make sure her parents are in bed. How can you split them? Unless there is a direct risk to these children, and we need to take them out quickly, it's very hard to ask Sarah and the children to leave Khaled behind.
Will you be meeting with any members of parliament today while you're here?
Since October, I've been meeting with many members of parliament, and ministers, and I've been speaking to them individually, and I will continue to do so until we bring them home. Yeah.
And, what kind of responses? What's the latest?
I continue to be optimistic. There is, MPs are sympathetic. Our MP, Spence Benjamin, is very supportive and is trying to do what he can, but, that is not translating into action to date.
Unless there's anything else that you want to add, anybody?
Well, just to go back to your first question, when you asked why don't they come home, there was 3 quick points that came to mind for me. Number one, I think there's a protection concern. Abandoning Khaled leaves him alone, and I would imagine the family feels that by having his Canadian citizen wife, the family more broadly there with him, that perhaps gives a bit of a greater sense of protection. Secondly, I think my understanding is there's some care issues. Khaled Al Qazzaz suffered considerably from his time in prison, has ongoing health considerations, and certainly it's helpful to have Sarah there to be of support and assistance on that front. And then third, of course, is the separation concerns, which you heard about very powerfully. To require the family to split with no prospect that it would perhaps only be for a short time, and quite the contrary, the possibility that it could stretch into an eternity, is traumatizing and really too much to ask of any of them.
So Sarah was under the impression that they would be able to bring her husband home immediately then. Did anyone ever advise against bringing the children with her?
No, we thought it was over. It was a Egyptian prosecutor general order to release him. He had never been charged in that year and a half of imprisonment. We thought, we were already planning his party. We had booked the hall. We were celebrating, and he was suffering, and so they went home. They went back to bring him home. It was a 2-week return ticket for all of them. He was dying to see his children. We couldn't say no. We never thought there would be a security risk. We never thought they would continue to subject him to other types of persecution and the family. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to do a picture in front of the